The shuttle doors opened with a hiss, and Cadet Yella stepped onto the arrival platform of the Unified Galactic Defense Academy. Her feathers pressed flat against her skull from sheer nervousness. Kael'thas Prime was everything the recruitment videos had promised, and everything her nightmares had warned her about. A massive orbital ring spinning slowly around a dead star, home to over 12,000 cadets from more than 400 species, all of them training to become the next generation of galactic military officers. Yella was a Vorni, a small avian species known more for their academic achievements than their combat ability, and she felt every centimeter of her tiny frame as she walked through the crowd of towering aliens heading toward the main assembly hall. A Grotharian cadet nearly stepped on her without noticing, his massive rhinoceros-like body casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. She dodged sideways and bumped into something hard and... "Sorry about that," a voice said from above her. She looked up and found a creature she had only seen in xenobiology textbooks, a human. He was tall by her standards, but apparently average for his kind, with dark hair cut short and calm brown eyes that looked down at her without any of the predatory intensity she had expected from a species classified as persistence hunters. "You okay?" he asked. "I am uninjured," Yella stammered, her translator clicking rapidly to keep up with her nervous speech. "Good," the human said, and he smiled at her before walking away into the crowd. She watched him go with her heart hammering against her hollow bones. That was her first encounter with Cadet Sergeant Elias Voss, and at the time she had no idea that he would eventually make her question everything she thought she knew about the universe. The main assembly hall was enormous, built to accommodate species ranging from the insectoid Silthari, who stood barely taller than Yella, to the massive Drevakin, who needed reinforced seating platforms to support their bulk. Yella found a seat near the middle and pulled up her datapad, trying to look like she belonged. A Silthari cadet settled into the seat next to her, his 8 limbs folding with mechanical precision, as he adjusted what appeared to be a personal logging device strapped to his thorax. "Cadet Kethrava," he said, without looking at her. "Silthari Analytical Corps, 3rd Intake Rotation." "Cadet Yella," she replied. "A Vorni Science Division, 1st Rotation." "1st Rotation," Kethrava repeated, and something in his compound eyes shifted in a way that might have been pity. Before she could respond, the lights dimmed and a figure walked onto the central stage. Walked was generous, because drill instructor Von Tarek did not walk so much as he imposed himself upon the ground with every step. He was Grotharian, nearly 3 meters tall, with skin like cracked stone, and a voice that hit Yella's chest like a physical force. "Welcome to the Academy," Von Tarek said, and the way he said welcome made it sound like a threat. He launched into the standard orientation briefing, covering rules and expectations and the various ways cadets could wash out or die during training, and Yella noticed that he listed these 2 outcomes as though they carried roughly equal weight. Then the holographic display behind him lit up with the Galactic Species Threat Classification Index. Every cadet in the hall sat up straighter. The index was the official ranking system used by the Unified Galactic Military to categorize the combat threat level of every known species, rated from Class 1, Harmless, to Class 12, Extinction Level Apex Predator. Von Tarek scrolled through the list, highlighting the species represented in the current cadet intake. A Vorni, Class 2, Minimal Physical Threat. Silthari, Class 4, Moderate Threat due to Venomous Mandibles. Grotharian, Class 9, Extreme Durability and Strength. And then, Human, Class 7, Persistent Endurance Predator. A murmur went through the hall, and Yella could hear the tone of it clearly. Dismissal. Class 7 was respectable but unremarkable, the kind of rating given to species that were dangerous enough to survive their homeworlds, but nothing that would make anyone nervous at a dinner table. Kethrava made a small clicking sound with his mandibles, that Yella was learning to interpret as mild contempt. Persistence predators, he said quietly. They chase prey until it collapses from exhaustion. A crude but effective survival strategy, nothing more. Yella glanced across the hall and spotted Elias sitting several rows away, and she noticed something that struck her as odd. He was not looking at the threat classification display at all. He was eating packet and was squeezing a bright red substance onto the food. And even from this distance, Yella could smell it. A sharp, chemical burn that made her eyes water, and her threat receptors fire. "What is that smell?" she whispered. Kethrava's antenna twitched violently. "Capsaicin," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something other than clinical detachment. "It is a chemical irritant derived from a plant genus native to Earth, a substance that triggers acute pain responses in most mammalian nervous systems." "He is eating a pain chemical?" "Recreationally," Kethrava confirmed, and he began typing something into his logging device with 3 of his 8 hands. Yella would later learn that this was the first entry in what Kethrava would come to call his Disturbing Human Behaviors Log, a document that would grow to over 400 entries by the end of their first semester. Von Tarek moved on to the final segment of the briefing, the survival examination. "At the end of this semester," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that silenced every conversation in the hall, "you will be deployed in squads to a live environment for a 72-hour survival assessment. Your destination will be Vytheris 4. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of attention, but the deep, biological silence of prey animals recognizing a predator's name. Vytheris 4 was a quarantined death world, one of only 11 planets in the known galaxy, where the environment itself was classified as actively hostile to sapient life. Yella felt her feathers lock rigid against her body. "Historically," Von Tarek continued, 68% of cadets pass this examination. I will leave you to calculate what happens to the other 32%. After the briefing, Yella found herself in the common room of her assigned dormitory block, surrounded by cadets who all looked various shades of terrified. She pulled up the Academy's xenobiology database on her datapad and searched for Vytheris 4, scrolling through entries on toxic flora, electromagnetic storms, and predatory megafauna, until she reached a file that made her blood go cold. "The Thesak," she read aloud, not realizing that several cadets had gathered behind her to look. "Native apex predator of Vytheris 4. Classification, Class 12. Someone behind her made a sound like air escaping a sealed chamber. "Class 12, Kethrava said from across the room. "The highest lethality rating ever assigned to a living organism in the galactic catalog. No sapient species has survived a direct encounter without military-grade weaponry." Yella kept reading, her voice getting smaller with every word. "Six-limbed quadruped, bioelectric cloaking capability, venomous spinal ridges, estimated bite force sufficient to shear through standard starship hull plating. Species has successfully evolved a natural defense against the Thesak." The common room was dead silent, and then from the doorway, a calm and entirely unbothered voice said, "Huh, neat." Every head turned. Elias Voss stood in the doorway, holding a cup of what Yella would later learn was coffee, a beverage brewed from roasted seeds and containing caffeine, a Class 2 neurotoxin to most galactic species. And he was reading something on his own datapad with the expression of someone browsing a mildly interesting wildlife documentary. He looked up, noticed everyone staring at him, and shrugged. "What?" he said. "It sounds cool." Then he walked to his quarters and closed the door. Yella looked at Kethrava. Kethrava looked at Yella. Neither of them said a word, but in that moment they reached a silent and mutual agreement that they were going to keep a very close eye on the human. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Yella's life, and she quickly learned that the Academy did not believe in gentle introductions. Every morning began before the station's artificial sunrise, with Von Tarek's voice blasting through the dormitory speakers. And every night ended with Yella collapsing into her sleep pod, with muscles she did not even know she had, screaming for mercy. But the training was not what kept her awake at night. It was the human. The first incident happened during the persistence drill in the 3rd week of training. The exercise was simple in theory. Cadets had to chase an automated drone across a 5-kilometer stretch of rough terrain, and the cadet who kept pace with it the longest received top marks. The Grotharian cadets exploded off the starting line like living battering rams, their massive legs eating up the ground in thunderous strides. And the Silthari cadets used their multiple limbs to scramble over obstacles with terrifying efficiency. Elias just started jogging. Yella watched from the observation platform as one by one the other cadets burned out, their bodies hitting species-specific walls of exhaustion that no amount of willpower could push through. The Grotharians lasted 40 minutes before their overheated bodies forced them to stop and vent excess thermal energy through their neck plates. The Silthari made it an hour before their exoskeletons began to lock up from lactic acid buildup. Elias kept jogging. 2 hours in, and he was the only cadet still moving, his pace unchanged, his breathing steady, his expression carrying nothing more dramatic than mild concentration. 3 hours in, and Von Tarak walked to the edge of the observation platform and stared down at the human with an expression that Yella had never seen on a Grotharian face before. Uncertainty. "End the drill," Von Tarak said quietly. "Sir, the drone is still active," his assistant replied. "I know. End it anyway. He is unsettling the other cadets." The second incident came during combat training. Elias was sparring with a Krethvalan cadet, a reptilian species with 4 arms and a natural talent for grappling, when a joint lock went wrong, and Yella heard a sound that made every feather on her body stand straight up, a wet, grinding pop that could only be a bone leaving its socket. Elias looked down at his hand, where his smallest finger was pointing in a direction that fingers were not designed to point, and without breaking eye contact with his sparring partner, he grabbed the finger with his other hand and wrenched it back into place with a second pop that echoed through the training hall. "Happens all the time," he said, shaking his hand out like he was flicking off water. "My bad. Want to keep going?" His sparring partner did not want to keep going. Down. 3 cadets behind Yella requested medical leave, not because they were injured, but because witnessing what Elias had just done had triggered acute stress responses in their species. Kethrava, standing beside her, typed furiously into his log. Entry 47. Human manually relocated a dislocated joint during active combat and resumed fighting. Pain response appears to be present, but is somehow subordinate to the human's decision to continue. I am beginning to suspect that humans do not experience pain the way other species do. Or worse, they experience it fully and simply choose to ignore it. The third incident was the one that truly changed how the cadets looked at Elias. It happened in the xenobiology lab during a lesson on species-specific toxin sensitivities, and the instructor, a thin, nervous Palathi with too many eyes, was explaining the galactic classification of common chemical compounds. "Caffeine," the instructor said, pulling up a molecular diagram, "is classified as a Class II neurotoxin, lethal in moderate doses to approximately 80% of known sapient species. It functions as a—" "Excuse me," Elias said, raising his hand. The instructor paused. Elias reached into his bag and pulled out a thermos, unscrewed the cap, and took a long, slow drink of a dark, steaming liquid, while the entire class watched in frozen horror. "Sorry," he said, lowering the thermos. "I just wanted to make sure I was paying attention. Please continue." The instructor did not continue, because the instructor had fainted. Yella stared at the unconscious Palathi on the floor, then at Elias, then at the thermos of neurotoxin he was casually holding, and she felt something shift in her understanding of the universe. But it was the fourth incident, the quiet one, the the one that nobody else seemed to think was significant, that stuck with Yella the most. She was walking through the dormitory corridor late one night when she heard a soft voice coming from a maintenance alcove, and she stopped and peered around the corner to find Elias sitting cross-legged on the floor with a broken cleaning drone in his lap. The drone was a simple machine, barely more sophisticated than a vacuum unit, with a cracked optical sensor and a motivator wheel that had seized up. Elias had his toolkit open beside him and was carefully replacing the damaged sensor while talking to the drone in a low, gentle voice. "There you go, Scraps," he said, soldering a connection with steady hands. "Almost got you fixed up. You took a nasty fall off that service ramp, huh?" "Yeah, I know. Those ramps are rough. But you are going to be just fine." The drone could not hear him. The drone could not understand him. The drone did not have feelings or thoughts or any form of consciousness whatsoever. But Elias spoke to it as though it were a frightened animal he had found injured on the side of a road. And when the repairs were done and the drone whirred back to life, he set it down gently and patted its chassis. "Good as new," he said. "Go on, buddy. You have floors to clean." The drone rolled away down the corridor, and Elias watched it go with a small, satisfied smile. After that, Yella noticed that Elias greeted the drone every morning when it passed through their dormitory block. And the strangest part was that after a few weeks, the drone started pausing when it reached Elias, as though it had incorporated him into its patrol routine as a checkpoint. Kethrava's log entry for that observation was the longest he had ever written. Entry 83. The human has formed an apparent emotional bond with a non-sentient cleaning unit. The unit has no capacity for reciprocal attachment, and yet the human continues to invest emotional energy in the relationship. Further research into human psychology suggests this is not an aberration, but a fundamental species trait. Humans will form social bonds with virtually anything, including inanimate objects. I have revised my threat assessment accordingly. Previous classification of this behavior as harmless is incorrect. A species that can bond with anything can also recruit anything as an ally. Threat level, significant. As the weeks passed and the survival exam drew closer, the cadets spent more and more time studying the file on the Thesek. The creature dominated every conversation in the common room, and Yella could see the fear building in her fellow cadets like pressure in a sealed chamber. The Thesek was not just dangerous, it was the most dangerous thing alive, a predator so perfectly evolved that the galaxy had been forced to invent a new classification tier just to describe it. Yella was reading the file one evening when she noticed Elias at the far end of the common room, reading the same file on his own datapad. But he was not reading the sections on lethality or combat tactics or threat responses. He had bookmarked a section titled Behavioral Patterns and Social Structures, and he was reading it with the same quiet, focused expression he wore when he was repairing scraps. Nobody else noticed, but Yella noticed, and somewhere deep in her hollow bones, she felt a strange and entirely irrational flicker of something she had not felt since arriving at the academy. The drop pod hit the surface of Vitherus 4 like a fist punching through wet clay, and Yella's vision went white for 3 full seconds before the impact gel released her and she tumbled forward onto her knees. The air hit her first. Even through her filter mask, the atmosphere of the death world pressed against her like a living thing, thick and warm and carrying the sweet chemical smell of something actively trying to dissolve her feathers. She scrambled to her feet and looked around. The jungle was nothing like the training simulations had prepared her for. The trees, if they could be called trees, rose 100 meters into a sky choked with electromagnetic haze, their trunks pulsing with slow bioluminescent light that shifted from deep blue to sickly green in patterns that almost looked like breathing. The ground was soft and wet, and covered in a carpet of organisms that Yella could not determine were plant or animal. And everything Every single inch shimmered with strange movement. Surface, every branch, every leaf, was moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that suggested the entire forest was one interconnected system, watching them with patient curiosity. "Squad 7, sound off," Elias said, his voice cutting through the disorientation like a blade through fog. One by one they answered. Yella, Kethrava, a Grotharan cadet named Tor, 2 Krethvalan twins called Ses and Ven, and a small Palathi engineer named Drith, who was already hyperventilating into her mask. 7 cadets, 40 kilometers of death world between them and the extraction point, and 72 hours to get there. Elias pulled up the terrain map on his wrist unit and studied it in silence for 10 seconds. "The canopy is too thick for aerial surveillance, so we are going to have to navigate by ground markers," he said. "Stay close, move in single file. Do not touch anything that glows orange, because according to the briefing file, that color means it is digestive. And it will dissolve your skin." Encouraging, Kethrava said. They moved. The first 6 hours were a slow, grinding nightmare. The jungle fought them for every meter, and Yella quickly understood why Vytharis 4 had earned its quarantine status. It was not just that the individual organisms were dangerous, but that the entire ecosystem seemed designed to funnel prey into kill zones. Twice they had to reroute around sinkholes filled with a clear liquid that Kethrava's scanner identified as a biological acid secreted by underground colonial organisms. Once they walked into a clearing that looked safe until Elias stopped the group and pointed silently at the ground, where the pattern of fallen leaves was too symmetrical, too perfect, and Yella realized with a lurch of her stomach that the entire clearing floor was the open mouth of something buried beneath the surface. "Around," Elias said simply, and they went around. Was exhausted, and Yella's legs felt like they had been replaced with bags of wet sand, but Elias had found them a defensible position, a rocky overhang where the stone was too dense for the burrowing organisms to penetrate, and the sightlines were clear in 3 directions. He built a shelter. Not in the way that the training manual described, with standardized components and regulation measurements, but in the way that someone who had lived in the wild before would build one. Fast, efficient, using natural materials that he somehow identified as safe, despite the fact that 90% of the plant life on this planet was actively trying to eat them. Yella watched him work, and remembered the partially redacted file that Kethrava had found weeks ago. Before the academy, Elias had served 2 years on a Death World colony. He had never talked about it, and nobody had asked, but watching him move through this nightmare landscape with the casual confidence of someone walking through a familiar park, Yella understood that this was not Elias's first time in a place that wanted him dead. This was just Tuesday for him. "Get some sleep," Elias told the squad. "I will take first watch." "You need rest as well," Kethrava said. "I am fine. Humans can function on reduced sleep for extended periods. It is one of our things." "One of your things," Kethrava repeated, and he added another entry to his log, with all 8 hands typing simultaneously. The second night was when everything changed. Yella was half asleep in the shelter when Kethrava's scanner let out a sharp tone that snapped every cadet awake like an electric shock. "Contact," Kethrava said, and his voice had a quality Yella had never heard in it before. Fear. Massive biosignature approaching from the northeast, range 200 meters and closing. "How massive?" Tor asked, the Grotharian reaching for his weapon, looked at his scanner, then looked at it again, then held it closer to his compound eyes as though hoping the numbers would change. "The reading exceeds the upper calibration limit of this device," he said. The jungle around them went silent. Not quiet, silent, in the absolute and total way that only happens when every living thing in the area has simultaneously decided to stop making noise because something worse than all of them has arrived. Yella felt it before she saw it. A vibration in the ground, deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat the size of a building. And then the bioluminescent light in the trees shifted, and through the gaps in the canopy, she saw it. The Thesak. It was bigger than the files had described, or maybe the files had simply failed to convey what 12 meters meant, when it was standing 30 meters away and looking directly at you with eyes that glowed like molten copper. 6 limbs, each one ending in claws that curved like scythes. An armored body covered in overlapping plates that shimmered with bioelectric energy. The cloaking field rippling across its surface like oil on dark water. And spines, rows of venomous spines running down its back that were raised and crackling with faint light. It did not roar. It did not need to. Its presence was enough. A silence so dense and heavy that Yella felt it pressing on her chest like a physical weight. Cess and Ven broke. The 2 Krethvalan twins bolted into the jungle before anyone could stop them, their forearms grabbing at branches as they fled in pure blind panic. The Thesak's massive head tracked their movement for 1 second, 2 seconds, and then nothing. It did not chase them. It turned its gaze back to the group and stood there, watching, with an expression that Yella's terrified brain could not process, because she had never seen anything like it on a predator before. Not the look of something hunting. It was the look of something deciding. "Nobody move," Elias said. His voice was quiet and calm and completely steady. And Yella looked at him and saw something that made the feathers on the back of her neck rise. He was not afraid. He was studying the Thesak with the same focused attention he gave to everything that interested him. His head tilted slightly to one side, his eyes moving across the creature's body with slow, deliberate precision. The Thesak held his gaze for a long, terrible moment. Then it turned and melted back into the jungle, its cloaking field swallowing it into the darkness, like it had never been there at all. The squad did not move for 5 minutes. "It is gone," Kethrava finally said, his voice thin. Elias was quiet for a moment longer. Then he pulled up the terrain map and began adjusting their route. Yella looked at the new path and felt her stomach drop. "Taking us through its territory," she said. "Yes." "That is toward where it went," she said. "Yes." "Elias, that is the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy." Elias looked up from the map and met her eyes, and in the blue-green bioluminescent light of the jungle, his expression was gentle and certain in a way that made absolutely no sense. "She has a den nearby," he said. "Probably has young. She was not hunting us. She was assessing us, checking if we were a threat to her babies." The silence that followed was so complete that Yella could hear Dritz's heartbeat through the Palathi's thin chest. "How could you possibly know that?" Yella whispered. "Body language," Elias said. Kethrava stared at him for a very long time, then opened his log and typed with trembling hands. Entry 212. The human claims to have read the emotional state of the galaxy's most lethal predator from a 3-second visual contact. I am no longer confident. In any of my previous threat assessments, I am no longer confident in anything. The canyon opened before them on the morning of the 3rd day, like a wound in the earth, its walls rising 30 meters on either side and carved with deep grooves that could only have been made by something enormous, dragging its claws through solid rock. Yella stood at the entrance and felt every survival instinct her species had evolved over 40 million years screaming at her to turn around. The signs were everywhere. Claw marks on the canyon walls, each one as long as her entire body. Acid-etched patches on the stone floor where prey had been dissolved and consumed. Shed scales scattered across the ground like fallen shields, each one the size of a dinner plate and still faintly humming with residual bioelectric charge. This was a Thesic nesting ground. Kethrava confirmed it with his scanner. his voice flat and mechanical, in the way it got when he was suppressing an emotional response too large for his Silthari processing to. Multiple biosignatures detected deeper in the canyon, he said. One adult, estimated mass 12,000 kilograms, and two juvenile signatures approximately 1/4 of the adult size. A mother and two young, Elias said, and there was something in his voice that Yella could not identify. Not fear, not excitement, something warmer than both. The extraction point is 8 kilometers beyond this canyon, Tor said, the Grotharian's deep voice tight with stress. If we go around, we add at least 20 hours to our route. We do not have 20 hours of supplies remaining, Kethrava said. Then we go through, Drith whispered, and immediately looked like she regretted speaking. The squad stood at the canyon entrance in silence, and Yella could feel the unspoken truth hanging over all of them, like a blade. They had to go through, and going through meant walking into the home of the most dangerous creature ever catalogued by Galactic. Elias set down his pack. "Wait here," he said. Yella's head snapped toward him. "What?" "I am going through first," he said, and he said it the way someone might say they were going to check the weather. "Alone, if it is safe, I will signal you to follow." "Elias, no." "Yella, the survival odds of a single unarmed sapient entering a Thesak nesting ground are 2.3%, Kethrava said, and he said the number like he was reading a deck sentence. Elias looked at Kethrava and smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made the corners crinkle. "I've had worse," he said. Then he turned and walked into the canyon. Yella scrambled for her long-range optics and pressed them to her eyes with shaking hands, and the rest of the squad crowded behind her in terrified silence as they watched the small figure of the human move deeper into the throat of the canyon. Slowly. Not the slowness of fear, but the deliberate, measured pace of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and why. His hands were at his sides, open and visible, palms forward. His weapon was still clipped to his belt, untouched. Yella realized with a jolt that he had left his pack behind on purpose. He was carrying nothing, wearing nothing that could be interpreted as threatening, presenting himself to whatever was in that canyon as exactly what he was. Unarmed, unarmored, alone. "What is he doing?" Tor breathed. "I believe," Kethrava said very quietly, "he is making himself non-threatening on purpose." "To a Class 12 apex predator?" Kethrava did not answer, because there was no answer that made sense. Through the optics, Yella watched Elias reach the midpoint of the canyon, where the walls widened into a natural amphitheater, and she saw the cave. It was large enough to fly a shuttle into, carved into the canyon wall by millennia of erosion, and from its dark mouth came a faint glow of bioelectric light that pulsed in the slow rhythm she had come to recognize as a Thesak heartbeat. Elias stopped walking. He stood in the center of the amphitheater with his arms at his sides and his gaze lowered, and he waited. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 2 minutes. And then the Thesak mother emerged from the cave. She was enormous, even having seen her before. Even knowing the numbers from the files, the reality of her hit Yella like a wall of ice water. 12 meters from nose to tail, 6 limbs moving with a silence that should have been impossible for something her size. Armored plates shifting and interlocking as she walked. Spines raised along her back and crackling with bioelectric energy that cast sharp blue shadows across the canyon walls. Her eyes found Elias and locked onto him with the focused intensity of a creature that had never hidden. Its entire evolutionary history needed to be afraid of anything. Behind her, 2 juvenile Thesak peered out from the cave mouth with wide bioluminescent eyes, each one already the size of a small transport vehicle. Every cadet watching through optics stopped breathing. Yaela's hands were shaking so badly that the image in her optics blurred, and she had to brace herself against the canyon wall. The Thesak mother approached Elias. Each step sent vibrations through the stone that Yaela could feel in her bones, even from this distance. And the bioelectric field around the creature intensified, until the air itself seemed to hum with barely contained power. She stopped less than 2 meters from the human. Her head lowered until it was level with his chest, and her breath, visible as a cloud of warm vapor in the canyon air, washed over him in slow, deliberate waves. She was scenting him, reading him, deciding. Elias did not move, did not flinch, did not do any of the 1,000 things that every survival instinct in the galaxy would have screamed at him to do. Instead, very slowly, he raised one hand, palm up, open, and he waited. The Thesak mother's eyes, those enormous copper-gold eyes that had been the last thing 1,000 prey animals had ever seen, studied his hand for a long, suspended moment. And then she pushed her head forward and pressed it into his palm. Yaela made a sound that was not a word in any language. Through the optics, she watched Elias begin to move his hand, gently, carefully, scratching behind a ridge of armored plate just above the Thesak's jaw, where the scales were thinner and the skin beneath was warm. The effect was immediate. The spines along the Thesak's back flattened one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. The bioelectric field dimmed from a crackling storm to a soft, warm glow that pulsed in time with the creature's breathing. And then the sound started, a deep, resonant vibration that rose from the Thesak's chest and filled the entire canyon, shaking loose pebbles from the walls and rattling the stones beneath Yaela's feet. It was purring. The most dangerous living organism in the cataloged galaxy was purring. The juveniles, apparently deciding that whatever their mother had found was safe, tumbled out of the cave in a scramble of oversized paws and half-formed spines, and bounded toward Elias with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of puppies. One of them reared up on its hind legs and planted its forepaws on Elias's shoulders, nearly knocking him over, and Elias laughed, a real warm human laugh, and caught the juvenile's head in both hands and scratched under its chin. The second juvenile circled behind him and curled up against his legs, its tail wrapping around his ankle as it settled down and began making a smaller, higher-pitched version of its purring. Mother's purr. Parentheses, Elias stood in the center of the canyon, with the galaxy's most lethal predator nuzzling his hand, and 2 juvenile apex predators climbing on him like he was a piece of playground equipment, and he looked. Yaela searched for the word and found it with a shock of recognition. Happy. He looked happy. Behind her, Yaela heard a series of sounds she would remember for the rest of her life. Tor sitting down heavily on the ground because his legs had stopped working. Drith making a high-pitched keening noise that was the Palathi equivalent of having one's entire worldview shattered. And Kethrava closing his logging device with a soft click, because for the first time in his life he had encountered something he did not know how to categorize. Far above them in orbit, drill instructor Von Tarik stood in the monitoring station watching the live feed from the canyon, his massive Gratharian hands gripping the console so hard that the metal was buckling under his fingers. "What in the 17 hells am I watching?" he whispered. His co-instructor, a veteran of 40 years of academy training, shook her head slowly and said nothing because there was nothing to say. In the canyon below, Elias gave the mother Thesak one final gentle pat on the side of her massive jaw, then carefully disentangled himself from the juveniles and stood up. The mother watched him as he walked back toward the canyon entrance, her copper-gold eyes tracking him with an expression that Yaela would spend years trying to describe in her personal log, and would never quite capture. It was not the look of a predator watching prey leave. It was the look of something that had been understood for the first time. Elias reached the squad and looked at their faces, the open mouths, the wide eyes, the trembling hands, the sheer blank incomprehension of 7 alien beings confronted with something their biology had no framework for. Processing. She will let us pass, he said calmly. Just stay calm and do not make eye contact with the babies. She is protective, but not aggressive. Reminds me of my dog back home, honestly. Katharava spoke, and his voice was small and stripped of every layer of analytical detachment he usually wore like armor. Your species, domesticated wolves. Yeah, Elias said. You look at the galaxy's most lethal predator, and you see something to befriend. Elias considered this for a moment, then shrugged. If it has eyes, it has feelings, he said. That is kind of our whole deal. The squad walked through the canyon in single file, past the nesting ground, past the mother Thesak who watched them go with her spines flat and her field dim, past the juveniles who chirped curiously but did not approach, and out the other side into the open jungle beyond. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Yella walked in silence, with tears running down her feathered face that she did not bother to wipe away, because something had broken open inside her chest, and she did not yet have the words for what was growing in its place. The debriefing room on Kael'thas Prime was standing room only, which was a problem because some of the species in attendance did not have legs to stand on, and had resorted to hovering, clinging to walls, or in the case of one particularly determined Dravakin, simply blocking the doorway with her enormous body and refusing to move. Word had spread fast. By the time Squad 7's shuttle docked at the Academy, the footage from Vytheris 4 had already been reviewed by every xenobiology department in the sector, forwarded to 3 separate military intelligence branches, and uploaded to the Academy's internal network, where it had been viewed so many times that the server had briefly crashed. Elias sat in a chair at the center of the debriefing room, facing a curved table of senior officers and scientists, and Yella thought he looked the way he always looked, calm, slightly puzzled by the attention, and mildly in need of coffee. The panel was headed by Admiral Sefka Vosrin, a Palathi with 12 eyes, and a reputation for never being surprised by anything, and even she was looking at Elias with an expression that suggested her record was about to be broken. Cadet Sergeant Voss, she began, we have reviewed the footage from the Vytheris 4 survival examination approximately 400 times in the last 16 hours. And I must confess that with each viewing, our understanding of what occurred has not improved. I am happy to explain, Elias said. Please do. Elias shifted in his chair and scratched the back of his neck in a gesture that Yella had come to recognize as his way of organizing his thoughts before saying something that would make everyone in the room question their fundamental assumptions about reality. So the thing about the Thesak is that she is a social predator, he said. The files classify her as a solitary ambush hunter, but that is not the full picture, because a solitary predator does not build a permanent den, and she does not raise her young for an extended period unless she has complex social behaviors. The panel stared at him. I noticed it the first night when she came to check on us, Elias continued. She did not approach with hunting posture. Her weight was centered. Her spines were raised for display, but not locked in attack position. And her cloaking was only partial, which meant she was not trying to hide. She wanted us to see her. You determined all of this from a 3-second observation in near darkness, Admiral Vosrin said. It was closer to 5 seconds, actually, and the bioluminescence helped. Katharava, sitting in the gallery behind Elias, made a sound that his species used to express the feeling of having one's intelligence thoroughly and repeatedly humbled. When I entered the canyon, Elias said, I made myself non-threatening using the same principles humans have used with large predators on Earth for thousands of years. Slow movement, low posture, exposed hands, averted gaze, no sudden gestures. I was basically telling her in body language that I was not a competitor and not a threat to her young. And the physical contact? Asked one of the scientists, a Silthari xenobiologist whose compound eyes were so wide they looked like they might detach from his skull. "She initiated that," Elias said. "When a social predator pushes its head into your hand, it is a trust behavior, same as a wolf leaning against you or a cat headbutting your chin. She was accepting me as non-hostile and inviting contact." "You are comparing a Class 12 apex predator to a domestic cat," the scientist said. "I mean, yeah, kind of," Elias said. "The scale is different, but the underlying social mechanics are the same. Mammals, reptiles, it doesn't matter. If a species raises its young and forms social bonds, then it has emotional intelligence. And if it has emotional intelligence, then it can recognize empathy." And the scratching, Admiral Vosserin said, and Yella noticed that the Admiral was gripping her chair in a way that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of rank. "Behind the jaw ridge is where the scales are thinnest," Elias said. "I figured it was probably a spot she could not reach herself. Same principle as scratching a dog behind its ears. Find the spot they cannot get to on their own, and they will love you forever." Silence filled the debriefing room like water filling a glass. "Cadet Voss," Admiral Vosserin said carefully, "are you telling this panel that what we witnessed was not a special ability, not a classified technique, not a military protocol, but simply instinct?" Elias thought about it. "Not just instinct," he said. "Instinct plus about 300,000 years of practice. Humans have been doing this since before we were technically humans. We co-evolved with predators on Earth. Wolves, big cats, bears, hawks. We learned to read their body language, and they learned to read ours. And somewhere along the way, we figured out that the best survival strategy was not to fight everything that could kill us, but to make friends with it." He paused. "We domesticated wolves and turned them into dogs. We tamed horses and rode them across continents. We taught hawks to hunt for us, and cats to, well, cats mostly domesticated themselves, honestly. But the point is that humans look at a dangerous animal, and our first thought is not how do I kill it. Our first thought is, I wonder if it is friendly." Another silence, longer than the first. "Could any human have done what you did?" the scientist asked. "Well, not any human," Elias admitted. "You need to be pretty calm about it, and you need to know what you're looking for. But the instinct is there in all of us. We see something with eyes, and we want to connect with it. It is just who we are." He smiled. "If it has eyes, it has feelings. That is what my grandmother used to say." The debriefing ended shortly after that, because the panel needed time to process what they had heard. And Yella suspected that several of them also needed time to sit quietly in dark rooms and reconsider their career choices. What happened next unfolded over the following weeks, with the slow, inexorable momentum of a planet shifting in its orbit. The Galactic Threat Assessment Board convened an emergency session for the first time in 30 years, and the sole item on the agenda was the reclassification of humanity. Injuries that would kill most species, operated on reduced sleep for days, and could apparently walk into the den of the single most dangerous organism in the galaxy, and walk out with it purring. The final vote was unanimous. Humanity was reclassified from Class 7 to Class 12, Apex Predator, with a unique subcategory that had to be invented specifically for them: Persistence and Bonding Hybrid. The official footnote in the Galactic database read, "Threat assessment is not based on individual lethality, but on the species' unparalleled ability to integrate itself into any ecosystem, social structure, or predator hierarchy through a combination of extreme physical resilience, biochemical adaptability, and an instinctive drive to form emotional bonds with other organisms, regardless of danger level. Humans do not conquer ecosystems, they join them. This may represent a greater long-term strategic threat than any conventional biological weapon." Footnote aloud to Yella in the common room, and when he finished, they both sat in silence for a long time. "Do you think he knows?" Yella asked. "Knows what?" "That they reclassified his entire species because of what he did." "I suspect," Kethrava said, "that if you told him, He would shrug and ask if you wanted to see pictures of his dog. Yella laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed freely since arriving at the academy. In the weeks that followed, the academy changed. Not in any official way. The schedule remained the same, the drills remained brutal, Von Tarek remained terrifying. But the way the cadets looked at the three humans in their intake years shifted in a way that was difficult to define but impossible to miss. It was not fear exactly, though there was some of that. It was something closer to wonder. Yella wrote about it in her personal log late one night, trying to capture what she had felt in that canyon on Vilaris 4. And I think I finally understand what makes humans different. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the fastest, or the most armored, or the most venomous. They survived their world not by being the most dangerous thing on it, but by being the most connected. They looked at wolves and saw partners. They looked at horses and saw freedom. They looked at the dark, and the cold, and the thousand things that wanted to eat them. And they said, I wonder if we can be friends. That is their power. Not claws or venom or armor, but the stubborn, irrational, unshakable belief that connection is possible with anything and everything. And the terrifying thing is that they are usually right. Kethrava formally requested to remain Elias's roommate for the duration of their academy tenure, and when the housing officer asked him why, he said it was for research purposes. His antennae were doing the thing that Yella had learned to recognize as the Silthari equivalent of a smile. He had stopped keeping his disturbing human behaviors log. He had started a new one titled Remarkable Human Behaviors instead. As for Elias, he seemed largely unaware of the seismic shift he had caused in galactic xenobiology and military classification theory. On the evening after the reclassification was announced, Yella found him in the common room, surrounded by a group of alien cadets, holding up his datapad and swiping through photographs. This is Max, he was saying, pointing to an image of a golden-furred quadruped with a lolling tongue and eyes full of uncomplicated joy. He is a golden retriever, which is a type of dog, and he is the best boy in the entire universe. What is a best boy? Asked a Krethvalan cadet, leaning forward with all four arms braced on the table. It means I love him, Elias said simply. Can all humans have these, dogs? Pretty much, yeah, have them. Elias grinned. I do not see why not. 4 cadets were crying. One had already pulled up the galactic import regulations on her datapad and was drafting a formal petition to introduce golden retrievers to her homeworld. Yella watched from across the room, with her feathers soft and warm against her skin, and she felt the thing that had broken open in her chest on Vitheris 4 settling into its final shape. Not a wound at all, but a door, one that Elias had opened without even trying, simply by being what humans had always been, the kind of creature that looked at the universe and wanted to pet it. Far away, on a quarantined death world, spinning slowly beneath a sky full of electromagnetic storms, a canyon sat in silence, under the glow of bioluminescent trees. In a cave carved deep into the rock, a Thesak mother curled around her sleeping young, her massive body rising and falling with each slow breath, her spines flat. Bioelectric field, a soft, warm pulse in the darkness. One of the juveniles shifted in its sleep, and something small fell from between its paws. A crumpled ration wrapper, dropped by a human who had walked into their home with open hands and gentle words. The mother reached out with one enormous forelimb and carefully, delicately, picked up the wrapper in the curve of a claw. She brought it close, scented it, and made the low rumbling sound that meant safe. Then she tucked it beneath her chin, and closed her copper-gold eyes. And in the darkness of the death world, the galaxy's most lethal predator held a scrap of something that smelled like kindness, and dreamed whatever dreams a creature dreams when it has been touched gently, for the first time in its long and solitary life.